Force Major Paul Max Moga from Air Combat Command's 1st Fighter Wing, and I fly the world's most advanced combat fighter, the F-22 Raptor.
As the host of Showdown Air Combat, I'm going to take you to a place few people have ever been before. Right into the cockpit as we relive some of the most compelling dogfights of all time. In fact, I'll be flying in a chase plane to describe the action as we reconstruct these epic duels with restored versions of the classic warbirds that fought them. We'll also analyze the remarkable technical features, examine the groundbreaking tactics, and get to know the extraordinary pilots who flew these planes on the original missions.
It will be an incredible journey, and I'm going to be your guide every step of the way.
Welcome to Showdown Air Combat.
January 14th, 1944. Yanking and banking wildly in this P-47 Thunderbolt, Don Gentilly is literally in a race with death. A pair of Focke Wulf Fw-190 Butcher birds are right on his 6, hounding him relentlessly over the fields of France. Not only are the 190s faster and more maneuverable than Gentilly's huge T-bolt at this altitude, but he's totally out of ammunition to boot. It's every fighter pilot's worst nightmare. And for Don Gentilly, it looks like there's no way out of it.
The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the most unique combat aircraft of World War II. With a maximum weight of almost 9 tons, it was the most massive single-engine fighter of its generation. Its firepower and ability to absorb enormous amounts of battle damage made it a favorite among some fighter pilots. But its sluggish rate of climb and limited maneuverability led others to despise the big plane. On the German side, the Focke Wulf Fw-190 was loved by virtually all of its pilots. Fast, ruggedly constructed, maneuverable, and well-armed, it was a far more balanced design than the P-47. The last thing a Thunderbolt pilot wanted was to get in a dogfight with a 190 at low altitude. Down near the ground in the thicker air, the T-Bolt's few advantages, such as incredible speed in the dive, were largely negated. But in early 1944, that's exactly what happened to a Thunderbolt pilot named Don Gentilly. The result was a heart-pounding dogfight and a song.
By the end of 1943, the long-anticipated Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe is still a half-year away. While the Germans continue to build defenses along their Atlantic wall, the brunt of the U.S. offensive is carried by its air forces. At the tip of the spear are the heavy bombers, which slam the German war machine with long-range mass daylight raids.
But the only way to really keep that up was to have the fighter escort for the bombers as far as they possibly could go. And at that point, the P-51 Mustangs were just coming into the theater. So the mainstay was really the P-47 Thunderbolt. And although it really didn't have the range of the later Mustangs, it did have the capability with external fuel tanks to go a good distance of the way.
Yet this isn't the only mission assigned to the massive Thunderbolt.
One of the other things that Fighter Command would do is send the fighter groups on what they called freelance missions, which were fighter sweeps designed to bring the Luftwaffe fighters up so that they could basically shoot them down. And the idea was to wear down the fighter defenses with these types of missions.
And given the huge losses being suffered by the bombers, there's plenty of wearing down left to do.
Goering was under immense pressure to stop these mass daylight bombing attacks, and he put some of his best units in occupied France in the effort to stop them. So as far as the units in France go, they were as deadly and as dangerous as any of the Allies had seen at that point, despite the fact that there were many new pilots going through Luftwaffe training to replace the ones that had been shot down.
The Luftwaffe's two main fighter types are the Me-109 and the Focke Wulf Fw-190. The 109 has formed the core of German fighter forces since the beginning of the war in 1939. The 190 is introduced 2 years later in 1941. The Germans name it the Butcher Bird. Generally loved by its drivers, it's still considered to be one of the best fighter planes of the entire war. The P-47 arrives in Europe in late 1942. But in sharp contrast to the FW-190, many of the new T-Bolt drivers are skeptical about their new ride.
Many of the fighter pilots first assigned to the P-47 upon seeing it were disappointed, some calling it a 7-ton milk bottle. But the Jug, as it became popularly known, was actually a very sturdy and rugged airplane. And once they adjusted from the switch in the 4th Fighter Group from flying Spitfires to the Thunderbolt, they actually put it to very good use. However, I would say most of them still pined for an aircraft of more maneuverability than the monstrous Jug.
One of the 4th Fighter Group pilots who least likes the monstrous Jug is a veteran named Don Gentilly. An American citizen, Gentilly had signed up with the RAF, flying Spitfires with the famed Eagle Squadron before the U.S. enters the war. He's already scored 2 victories and has little desire to trade in his sleek Spit for the chunky new American plane. Yet despite the early doubts of Gentilly and many other pilots, the ruggedness of the big T-Bolt quickly becomes apparent. As a combat experienced pilot myself, I can tell you that one thing a fighter pilot really appreciates about his ride is when it brings him home safely. And the P-47 can do that better than almost any fighter in history. A big reason for this is the T-Bolt's enormous 2,000 horsepower radial engine.
That in itself dictated that the construction of the airplane was going to be robust, to say the least. The massive engine afforded the pilot protection from small arms fire that other aircraft were susceptible to. For instance, the P-51 Mustang was water-cooled, and one .30 caliber shot could bring one down, whereas the Thunderbolt, with its air-cooled engine, was much sturdier, and it would take a lot more to bring it down. So the pilots came to appreciate that, and the fact that with its 8 50 caliber machine guns and the ability to carry ordnance such as 500-pound bombs under wing, it was great for close air support.
But dogfighting with German fighters is a totally different story.
Well, the Thunderbolt could dogfight with anything at 30,000 feet. The problem is the Germans typically didn't fight at that altitude. Even coming at the bombers, they would come head-on into the bomber streams and then split S or dive down to recover and come back and attack again.
The lower the altitude gets, the harder it becomes for Thunderbolt drivers to dogfight. That's because at lower altitudes, the Jug can't employ its tremendous speed in a dive to either attack or escape from the German fighters. This is especially true when it comes to dogfighting the FW-190. One reason is that the Butcher Bird is far more maneuverable than the Jug. It's also more heavily armed than most variants of the Me-109, mounting a deadly array of machine guns and cannons.
So to get caught in the crosshairs of a Focke Wulf was a very, very dangerous proposition, and with an aircraft that wasn't able to dogfight with it effectively, at least at lower altitudes, Thunderbolt pilots were in danger entangling up with the Focke Wulfs.
And yet this is just what T-Bolt driver Don Gentilly does in January 1944, and not with one, but 2 190s. How can he possibly pull it off? Let's take a closer look at the 2 planes to see if we can figure it out. The Republic P-47D Thunderbolt is 36 feet 1 inch long and has a wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine churns out 2,000 horsepower, driving the Jug to a top speed of about 433 miles per hour and a maximum ceiling of 42,000 feet. The Focke Wulf FW-190A is 29 feet long with a span of 34 feet 5 inches. Its 14-cylinder BMW radial engine generates about 1,700 horsepower, giving the plane a top speed of 408 miles per hour and a ceiling of over 37,000 feet. It looks like the Jug has a slight edge in top speed and about a 5,000-foot higher maximum ceiling. But since our dogfight happens at low altitude, where the thicker air limits the top speed of both planes to about 350 miles per hour, we can scratch those advantages off the list. So what about the rest of the P-47's technical package? There's only one way to find out, by examining this massive fighter in person.
This is the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. As you can see, everything about this plane is big, from its huge four-bladed prop to its thick fuselage structure. But there's a lot more to this classic warbird than sheer size. Packed inside it are a multitude of sophisticated features that made it one of the more advanced fighters of its day.
So let's get into this thing and see what it's got.
Okay, the Thunderbolt cockpit. Wow, this is a big cockpit for a big plane. This is about the size of an Eagle cockpit. It's certainly bigger than a Raptor cockpit, which is kind of strange because a Raptor is such a huge plane, but it is a nice, roomy cockpit, and it's got everything you need as a fighter pilot to get the job done. It's laid out very similar to most U.S. fighters from back in World War II. You start with the left side, you've got the flap switch, you've got the landing gear handle. It's got the elevator trim, the rudder trim tab, and also the aileron trim, which was important in this plane because the ailerons are very big. They're about half the distance of the wing. Now, when you have ailerons that are that big, sometimes when you're flying at higher speeds, it exerts an extra pressure on the stick when you're trying to fly them. So you like to try and trim that out. And this Thunderbolt, even though it was such a big plane, it had a roll rate that was equal, if not better, than some of the other German fighters that it was trying to face. So excellent roll rate, but in order to produce that roll rate, you have to have those big ailerons out there. It's got a stick, and you've got the pickle button to shoot the rockets or drop the bombs, and then the trigger to obviously fire the guns. The instrument panel is very standard, and it's very well laid out. You've got everything you need right in front of you. The visibility is great. Behind you, you do have that armor plating that's going to be able to block any bullets from anybody that's at your 6 o'clock that's trying to gun you. So the offensive is great as well. I can see off of each side, I've got my 450 cals off of each side to be able to target whatever is in front of me, whether it's an enemy plane or something that I'm trying to strafe on the ground. And that is a lot of firepower out there. So this cockpit is well laid out. You've got your offense on the sides, you've got your defense front and back, so what a great cockpit for a great fighter.
Yet no matter how impressive the T-Bolt cockpit is, so far it looks like the FW-190 drivers have a clear edge over Don Gentilly, especially since their dogfight happens at low altitude. But there's only one way to know for sure, and that's to visit an FW-190 for myself.
2 machine guns up top, 4 20mm cannons is a lot of whoop-ass coming your way if you're in a P-47 or whatever other plane that this thing is trying to take out.